Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to be covering Dart fundamentals, so syntax and functions and classes. So because this video is part of a junior developers course module, it's important to read code easily, and when we start looking at real Flutter code, you may not need to know all the features that's on the screen or what's happening, but if you understand how to read the syntax and what functions and classes are on a basic level, you'll have a lot easier time. So in the last video, I set up the Flutter SDK, installed Visual Studio Code with everyone, and we generated a project called Hello World. So I'm going to open that. I have it minimized here. And what we're going to do is I deleted main.dart. It's in the lib directory here because it's super confusing. And even to senior developers, it's still confusing because all the code in that example is just squashed into one file. It's not at all reminiscent of how a real Flutter app is written. So I'm starting from the basics. So I deleted main.dart from my lib directory, and I'm going to right click the lib directory and I'm going to hit new file, and I'm just going to recreate it again. I'm just going to have a blank main.dart file. I'm also going to open my simulator. Okay, so let's cover functions in Dart really quickly. So a function is something that lets us run a bit of code. So functions can be reused. They can have input and output optionally, and it lets us organize our code in a simple way. So how we do that in Dart is when we want to declare a function, we could just type the function name. So I'm going to write here a function called main, and I'm going to give it some curly brace here. So this is how we define a function. And so functions do certain things. So if I have, this is the code for my function here, I can define another function called like do something, and another called do something else. Now in Dart, notice that this is in camel case. So all the function names have to be in camel case. Camel case is basically title case, but the first word not being capitalized, the first letter of the first word not capitalized. So every subsequent word has to be, their first letter has to be capitalized. So this is camel case. So it's really important to use camel case when you're writing Dart code. You're not going to write do something. You're also not going to write do something here. That's how you define a class. That's the convention for when you define a class. We'll get to classes in a minute, but just make sure that you take care to your cases. You're also not going to say do something. And you're not going to say, yeah, I already went over that. So that's just really important. So this is how I define functions. And if I want to invoke a function, that means I can run that function. I can perform all the code that's inside that function. I can just type the name of the function and parentheses, but then end it with a semicolon. So a semicolon in Dart here is required for every statement. So if I'm going to call do something 3 times, each line that this is on, each thing that it does has to be ending by a semicolon. This is how the compiler knows that this is one unit of work, and then it's going to do this, and then it's going to do this, right? So I can say like this and whatever. So next, when I want to kind of just get something to work here. I don't want to start delving into Flutter code yet. So I'm going to show you a basic function that comes out of the box with Dart called print. So print just prints something on the screen. It prints something to the command line here, and I'll show you that. So print accepts a string. So in Dart, there's different data types. There's the basic data types are string, integers, and booleans. So those are very, very basic. I'll be covering data types in a second, but all a string is just a string of characters. That's all it means. So the way we take a string and use strings is that whatever string we write here, this is a string. So if I type hello there, all strings have to be wrapped in single quotation marks. So this thing here is a string. I'll get to integers and booleans in a minute. But when I write print, it's going to take the whatever string we pass it, and it's going to print it out to the screen. So I'm going to say hello there, something else for this function here. And so I'm going to save my file. So when I save my file, and in Visual Studio Code, the last video, we installed the Flutter extension for Visual Studio Code. It's going to format our code for us. So if I have something weird like this and I hit save, it's going to automatically format our code for us. So we've defined a number of functions, and in the main function here, that's going to run, because that's what Flutter looks for when it starts. It's going to run these, it's going to run do something 3 times and this do something else once. So let's hit F5, or you can go to debug and start debugging here. And what this is going to do is it's going to run our Flutter app. I mean, this is technically a Flutter app, but we don't have any Flutter widgets here or anything because we haven't gotten to that yet. But it's still going to run something because we defined this main function. And you're not going to see something on the screen because it's not rendering or drawing anything on the screen. When we run this print function, it's going to output it to the command line. So in Visual Studio Code, there's a special panel that pops up here from the bottom. You can open it with Command J, or if you're on Windows, Control J. And basically, whatever, it's going to output basic stuff like diagnostics and special things that we need to know about when we run our app. But also, if I use this print function, it's going to print whatever we type in there. So hello there is run 3 times, and hello there's something else. So that's just a really quick and easy way to get started with functions in Dart. Like when you learn any other programming language, it's the same thing. There's some kind of print function. Like in JavaScript, there's this console.log function. In Ruby or C# or C++, Java, they all have their own functions that do exactly the same thing. But what matters is that you understand how to define functions like so, and also invoke or run those functions. So that's just basic functions. Okay, so before we get into classes, I want to kind of rename these functions to something that makes a lot more sense. So let's say I have a mobile app and I have a header section and a body section. I'll rename this function to, say, render header, meaning render is a fancy word for paint or draw. So I can render a header, I can render a button, some text, I can render an image, etc. So I'm going to say render header, and then I'm going to say render body, right? But I want to group my functions now into things that make sense. I want it to kind of classify these functions. So I want to classify everything that is related to the header section of my screen into its own class. So what I do, what I use for that is what's called a class. So a class classifies code. So whereas a function lets you group statements into something that's reusable, a class lets you group variables and functions together. So to define a class, I just say class, and then I could just give it the name. I can just call it, let's say, my header widget, and then some curly brace, and then that's it. So I'll have a class header widget, and I'll have a class body widget. So I'll get into later how to define widgets, because there's a specific way to do that in Flutter. But for now, I'm just going to call it a widget. So I have render header here and render body. So to basically continue here, I will show you now variables, because you can not only define functions in a class, you can also give class properties. So let's say I have a header widget and I want to define the height for that header. Well, I can just type, just use a variable for that. So a variable in Dart is basically a container for data. So a variable can have different data types. It could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be a Boolean. So I can just say var, which is defining a variable, and I could say height equals 100, and then semicolon because this is a specific statement. So the header widget has a height of 100. Okay, this is an integer. So an integer is a fancy term for a number. That's all it is. I can just give it another variable called title, right? So hi there, like this, right? So there's a height and a title. So there's other data types like true, like Boolean. You can have true or false as Boolean. It can only have a true or false value, but that's just basic variables. So that's it. So if I want to use my class here, I have to create an instance of it. So creating an instance of a class, it means that you're going to take what that class represents and you're going to create a copy of it, where the class is basically a template. So what that does is that lets me reuse that class in multiple areas of my app. So let's say I want to reuse this header widget in many areas of my application. I'm going to create different instances of the header widget. So an instance is basically a variable. It's essentially a variable. So I can say var here in main, and I'm going to say header equals. And to create an instance of my header widget, I write in the name of the class name, and then with some parentheses, start and end parentheses, and then a semicolon. So that means this is a complete statement, the semicolon I need. So I now have a instance of my class I can use. So I can say header dot. Now what dot does, and I'm going to say render header. So what dot does, it lets me refer to members of my class, and a member is basically this. It's either a variable or a function, pretty much. It basically lets me refer to members of my class. So I could say header dot render header. So same for body widget. So I could say var body, and then create an instance of body widget. And then I'm going to say body dot render body. There. So what do you think will happen when we run this code? I'm going to run my app. Now, you might know about Flutter's hot reload feature. If you don't, that's okay. I'll get into it in another video. But the hot reload won't work here because we're not using widgets or rendering anything on the screen. We're using the Dart's print function. And what that's going to do is, if I hit on a Mac Command J or Control J on Windows, it's going to pop up the debug console, and make sure you have the debug console selected. So I have this highlighted here. There's other panels here I think I've shown you, but that's the debug console, and it's going to print hello there, and then hello there something else. So that's pretty cool. So that's basically it. That's functions and classes. This is kind of a contrived example, but I hope that when we dive into real Flutter code, it'll look a lot just simpler to you because you're just getting used to this. So play around with the code a bit, test things out, run it for yourself, and make sure you're generally comfortable with it. You don't have to be an expert at the end of the day, but as long as you have the basic gist of what functions and classes are, you'll be all set for the next lesson.